This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. So this episode is creating a space for the difficult experiences and conversations around educator burnout. But the conversation we are having today is far beyond what we normally discuss or expect to hear. So this conversation is more personal, and we will be asking the question of, is this sustainable? And we'll be unpicking and building on the points raised in Eva's article around educator burnout. So let me introduce my guest, Eva Kyriacou Anastasi. So firstly, Eva, thank you very much for sharing your time and sharing this space with me.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody.
So let me just introduce Eva quickly. So Eva is an education consultant and trainer, previously an assistant vice principal at a primary academy school in North London. She was a year one class teacher responsible for early reading across the school and also phase leader of early years. So let's get straight into it. Your article, you discuss that this is one of the most difficult years for educators yet. And unfortunately, at the start of the year, we already sadly saw the proof with the regrettable death of head teacher Ruth Perry, who took her own life following an Ofsted inspection where her school was downgraded from outstanding to inadequate.
Yeah, and it's absolutely tragic. And I think, in fact, we could probably have a whole episode on the question of Ofsted. But for now, I think it's safe to say, obviously, her death it's absolutely tragic. And it's set within the wider context of a profession which is just in crisis. As a result of chronic underfunding, the marketisation and datafication of education, the insurmountable pressures of working through a pandemic. And in this case, Ofsted was understandably just that last straw. So it feels like it's a time that we need to really learn from this. Because if this isn't evidence that Ofsted just is not fit for purpose in its current form, then I just don't know what is. So it feels like a really pivotal moment that we really need to learn from.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I definitely agree with that. It would be a missed opportunity if we didn't really take, those important learnings from this. And it's without a doubt that working in education has incredibly high pressures. And as you discuss in your article, you fear that this will be one of the hardest years teaching yet. But you mentioned that in different ways to previous years. So I just wondered, why do you think it will be different to previous years?
Sure, I think it feels different generally. I think from September, the first couple of weeks of term, I remember thinking it always feels intense and it's always chaotic. But it just something felt different at the start of this year. And I think as the year's gone on, that's kind of been the narrative, at least in my case. And I think some of the reasons for that is the context of what's currently happening. So frozen budgets, no resources, teachers have always for years been and other staff in education have always been funding resources for their classes or whatever it might be, but it seems to have kind of really come to a head now. No option for cover, scarce PPA, no lunch cover. I think there's fewer people being asked to do more. And also this idea of performance punishment for people who are really, if you're good at your job, you'll be asked to do more. So actually your workload is increasing. And lots of times it's relying on, it feels like the system is relying on that kind of good nature of teachers and staff to want to do the best for the children. Also, I think because of inflated staff expectations, because we're seeing the impact of missed school from the pandemic, we're seeing that despite that additional teaching and those interventions that we've been putting in across the last year or so, the data is showing that the progress is still not enough, whatever enough might be. And those pressures are being felt by the senior leadership teams, and then that's cascaded down to staff. And it feels like there's higher expectations at an earlier stage of the year. So already from, say, autumn 1, we were having more intense pupil progress meetings than we would have had a year ago or 2 years ago. So it just feels like everything's kind of stepped up again. I think also the emotional needs of the children are understandably still at an all-time high. But there's, in the context of those kind of academic and attainment pressures, there's not enough time allocated to focus on this and to try and meet those needs. And I think as a staff body, we just don't have the training to support in the way that we need to. I mean, there's a lot of great resources out there and great training out there, and lots of teachers trying to address this issue. I can think of one example. So good morning, Miss Foster. I don't know if you've seen her on Instagram, but really fantastic work on behaviour, training available, which is fantastic. But that is reliant upon predominantly teachers being willing to
that information.
Absolutely, and to spend their own money, whereas that really needs to be, that's a need of the whole sector for the children, isn't it? I think also in lots of schools, the concept of like well-being is another thing which we kind of know we need to do something about in light of the last few years and the wider context. And in lots of schools, really great things are being done. But I think it comes down to, you know, are we doing it in a tokenistic way, or are we doing it in a really meaningful way? And often it's even, no matter how invested SLT might be into the well-being of their staff, they're really limited in terms of what are our resources or training or time for this, or money. What can we actually do to support this? Because if we're having to use staff to continuously cover, we're continuously cutting their lunch and all these kind of things. Those are the things which make a difference to well-being, not a Friday breakfast, which is lovely. But if from Monday to Thursday you're working 7 till 6, actually that Friday breakfast isn't going to do very much, really.
It reminds me of, you know, in your article, the concept of kind of self-care versus aftercare, which we're going to discuss a little bit later on. But I completely can relate to that. Mostly after reading that part of your article, it kind of never really clicked for me. It kind of didn't have it at the forefront of my mind, but then reading it and thinking, oh my God, yes, this does happen. You know, why aren't we actually seeing this all the time and aware? I guess, why aren't we aware of this?
I think it's something that a lot of staff, well, I know in my case, it's just, you kind of accept that, like, this is how it is. This is just the system, and this is part of working in a school. This is just how it has to be. But I think now we're seeing, because staff are being pushed so far, it feels like the first time that we've got a bit of momentum to say, well, actually, no, it's just not good enough, and it shouldn't be like this. And actually, it's definitely not serving the children, and it's not serving the staff. And I think on top of all those things, Ofsted don't really take any of that context into account in a really meaningful way. So it's kind of like they're just essentially carrying on like nothing's happened, business as usual. And I remember even after we opened after lockdown, that was the kind of narrative from SLT that, okay, business is normal. It's like
back to normal.
We've just gone through a global pandemic. We don't even understand what's just happened, let alone how we need to alter what we offer to the community. So actually, no, it shouldn't be business as normal. We need to reflect, and we need to make changes.
Things
so I think
are different, aren't they?
Exactly. So all those things I think are reasons why it feels really different this year. And it feels like the last few years everything's been kind of brewing, and it's kind of like at a really critical,
this is like the
moment
pinnacle
right now.
of all those,
Exactly.
changes, experiences. Yeah.
Exactly, which is on the one hand really scary
Mm-hmm.
because of,
Mm-hmm.
I think, the level of kind of dysfunction and the problems within the system are like really coming to the surface now. But I think it's also a really exciting time, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the first time the profession feels like it's everybody's really kind of galvanized and working
Yeah.
together, and kind of really fighting now for a voice and to fight
Mm-hmm.
that narrative that maybe the media is trying to put out against
Mm.
education staff,
Yeah.
um,
It's
and
an
trying to make
opportunity.
changes.
Yeah, exactly. It's an opportunity for change, isn't it? It's an
Yeah,
opportunity for
yeah, I
advocacy.
think so.
Um, and something that is really important to me and that I've kind of reflected on, and what I'm sharing with the sector is the fact that we need to actively advocate now for the early childhood sector, because
Yeah.
we say we're advocates, but how far do we actually go? And I think sometimes,
Mm.
of course, there's a lot of pressures, but sometimes we do need to kind of step up our game a little bit and shout louder, because a lot of the time we are preaching to the converted. We're having these discussions within the sector and with each other, but we don't quite enough shout about early childhood in the wider context in society.
Yeah.
So certainly that active advocacy, I think, is something which we need to move towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really great to see, I think, with social media as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of key figures in the teaching community who have built up a really great platform,
Mm-hmm.
and are starting to use that platform to actively advocate, which we haven't really seen before,
Mm-hmm.
which is really, really, really great.
Yeah, it's the power of kind of the digital age and social media. It's all about how you use
Definitely,
it, isn't it? And I think a lot of
absolutely.
practitioners might actually still be a little bit cautious about it, um, in terms of all of the kind of politics that goes on social media. But it's all about making sure that we are on each other's side as the sector. We're supporting each other. That's the main thing, because we are all here for the same cause anyway. It's all about the children. I think that is something that we always need to keep um, in the forefront of our minds, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what this change is about, isn't it? We want
Hmm.
to we want an education system which serves the children,
Hmm.
but also isn't at the detriment of staff. But yeah, absolutely, the children are at the heart of that.
Hmm. So now I wanted to bring the conversation onto something not discussed in your article, but I think it's very interesting and relates to this discussion.
Sure.
So I listened to a few podcasts featuring Simon Sinek, who's a motivational speaker and author, and he talks a lot about leadership. And he discusses a term I've not heard until recently, but I completely get how it relates to the early childhood sector. And this term is ethical fading, or this concept. And ethical fading is described as a form of self-deception. It occurs when we subconsciously avoid or disguise the moral implications of a decision. So it allows us to behave in immoral ways while maintaining the conviction that we are good or moral people. So I was kind of really trying to understand that concept and that definition, because, like I say, I've not come across
Mm.
it before. And Simon Sinek explains that ethical fading originates from pressures that we are put under, like we were talking about in the sector, and we begin to rationalize certain decisions and actions and accept that it's the system and
Mm.
this is how it is. Um, so this problem almost always comes from leadership as well. And I feel like this is kind of related to that neoliberal context of the early childhood sector, those pressures around data and performance and all of that. So sometimes all of these pressures then make us kind of become unethical, and not really living true to our own values and
Mm.
morals. And I think it's just so important to be able to reflect on that. Like everything that we do, all the decisions that we make, are they in line with our personal values and ethics? And yeah, just kind of wondering like what your thoughts are on that, basically.
Yeah, I
especially,
think,
with the context of leadership.
yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think it's probably been a key feature throughout my teaching career. I just didn't have the language, so I'd never heard of that term, ethical
Yeah.
fading, but it's something I've described it like in conversations with as like a kind of moral tension of like,
Hmm.
I don't really want to do this, and I feel like it's not right, but it's those things that you were saying, that it's the system and I've just got to tick
Hmm.
this box and I've got to ask my staff to tick this box. I think I can definitely relate to it, and I can definitely think of examples where I've done it, or I can think of staff members that have, and
Hmm.
colleagues that have experienced that kind of moral tension, and we're kind of checking in with each other and saying, I really don't want to do this, like I'm not comfortable doing it. And probably the most prominent one in my mind would be when it comes to data entry. So my like area of expertise is reception. That's my thing. So I've done nursery
Hmm.
reception, but reception is really my thing. And when it comes to crunch time in June for GLD data and
Hmm.
submitting that, there's always throughout the year this kind of target figure. What's our target figure going to be from
Yeah.
SLT? And obviously every cohort is totally different. So you can bear in mind last year's target, but this is a whole new group of children with totally different needs, and social emotional needs, communication, like everything is totally different. Um, so actually, we're not talking about money or assets, or we can't build on last year's projections.
Hmm.
We're talking about human beings.
Yeah.
Um, and we're meant to be thinking about the whole child, and their holistic
Hmm.
development. So that tension of from SLT to think about, okay, your projection from, or your attained figure from last year was, I don't know, 90% or whatever it was. This year, let's go for 96. It's like, well, actually, do you know who we've got in our cohort?
Hmm.
What was their starting point? Even if we get to 70% for this year, okay, it might not be national average or whatever, and of course we'll be aiming for above. But actually, if their baseline was very low, the level of personal progress across all areas of learning might have been really, really big. But you do feel pressure as when it comes to those key kind of data entry points of, we have to reach this certain figure. And there is
Hmm.
a kind of cap of which figure is going to be palatable and what's really not going to be
Mm.
received very well,
Yeah.
and what just doesn't fly in this school or in this context. So I think I definitely relate to that, and that definitely resonates, that concept of ethical fading. And I think the idea that, okay, the first time you kind of do it, you're like, okay, doesn't sit right, but
Hmm.
it's done now, I can forget about it and we'll just focus on the day to day, and I'm here for the kids and it's fine.
Yeah.
But I think gradually, when it's like, oh, it's that time of year again, I have to do it again, I have to do it again. And
Hmm.
in thinking about it from my own like kind of career point of view, I've done that at class teacher level, but then having to do it at like early years middle management level, so early years lead level, to say now I'm asking the teachers in my team to do that, because I've
Hmm.
got the pressure of, you need a certain percentage GLD,
Yeah.
so I have to cascade that message down and say,
Yeah.
but that figure's not going to fly, guys, we need to find a way to make it happen.
So
um
you're kind of like, you're almost lying to yourself. You're lying to them. You're kind of like, I don't agree with this, but we're going to have to do this. It just
yeah,
takes on that extra level, doesn't it? I guess you probably experience a lot of guilt when you're in that position, because you're like, oh, well, I'm only doing this because someone told me. But now you're the person that tells other people to do what you don't
exactly.
agree with.
Yeah, so that tension is just intensified. And I think if
Mm.
you're in a kind of healthy working environment, then
Hmm.
you would hopefully feel comfortable to be able to have those challenging conversations, to say, um, this is just where we are, this is where the
Mm.
children are. Whereas if you're in quite a toxic work environment, and lots of schools are, unfortunately, it can be, it's more than just being able to voice and say, oh, this is a tension for me, this doesn't sit right. Because actually in those kind of environments, it, whether perceived or a real threat, it feels like if I voice this and if I don't fall into line, I'm going to have a target on my back. And then it becomes a question of kind of livelihoods and people's careers. And it's kind of weighing up those options of how far am I willing to go, to stick to, you know, to keep my job as I'm enjoying doing it, and how much does that not sit right with me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a really difficult one, but a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and such a kind of, it becomes so personal, doesn't it? It becomes, it's just so personal to every individual. There's no like, there's such blurred lines between that, your professional career and you as a person, because like we say, your morals, your ethics are involved here. So it just makes everything so much more difficult. Those pressures then pile up, and yeah, it affects, you know, yourself, as like we say about children's development being holistic. It affects the whole holistic person there, you know, as the adult, as the educator.
But also what that's doing to the children. So if staff are feeling that pressure, they're not happy. You're not happy in yourself if you're feeling that constant kind of moral tension when you're just trying to do your job. And you feel like you can't voice, you can't be your authentic self and challenge and say, well, actually, why are we doing it that way? What if we just were transparent and said, you know, we've got a very different cohort this year. Our data is going to take a knock, but actually we know that we've worked on speech and language or whatever we've done to meet the needs of those children. And I think it links back to what we started talking about at the beginning around Ofsted, and is this sustainable? And I think the current setup, the current system, it just isn't. And the turmoil that we're seeing is educators just saying enough, that something just needs to change.
Yeah, like you're saying, it's kind of that pinnacle, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
And I guess when you're under kind of that level of stress, that you're violating your own ethics, then you're more likely to take out that stress on those close to you, unfortunately. And then of course you become demotivated in things, you know, of moving forward, advocating, and being there for the children as well. Like we were saying earlier, of course it affects our relationships with everyone around us. So it's incredibly unhealthy, and it then has an impact on obviously your mental health, and I think this just shows the huge impact of workplace pressures, and the state of our education sector now. So I thought that this takes us onto that discussion around relationships. So this is something that you do discuss quite a bit in your article, the relationships and teaching. So I just wondered if you wanted to kind of expand a little bit more about this.
Yeah, sure. I think it can be really isolating as to be not just a teacher, but any member of staff working in education right now. It can feel really isolating because as much as friends and family, you know, are around you and want to be there for you, I think unless you are in it and have lived and breathed it, I think it's just almost impossible to understand. Probably quite similar to you know, any of these kind of public service sectors, you know, NHS. I think it's really difficult to understand what that person is feeling and experiencing, and to be able to support them, just because you don't have that experience.
Yeah.
And it can be really hard as somebody working in education to be able to maintain relationships or have time or even the motivation to kind of invest in friendships, in relationships with parents, siblings, all those kind of things, because it's such a giving, you know, you're giving so much of yourself, of your whole self, every day in, day out, that by the time you come home, you just
There's
have
nothing
nothing
left.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's in the
Mm.
article that I talk about how, like, coming home on a Friday night, 7, 8 years into teaching now, and my dream, which is just so depressing, is to just come home, shut myself off from the world, not talk to anyone, pizza ordered, and early night by 9 o'clock. Like, that's just so depressing. And
Mm.
after years and years of doing that, essentially, I think your relationships inevitably take a knock, because
Mhm.
as patient and understanding as your friends and family might be, if you can only really invest in those relationships, say during the holidays, so every
Mhm.
6 weeks there's like a nice injection of investment into those relationships, and then they know that you're going to be essentially MIA for
Mhm.
about a month and a half, and then you'll be back. It's kind of, you, you don't get that depth of relationship, which I think is really difficult, because actually going through being in education now, you need emotional support and you need depth to your relationships to kind of get you through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of a catch-22, because you need it, but you don't have that
You don't have
time
time
and
for
that
it.
energy
Yeah.
to invest in it. So I think it's really
And
difficult.
I think the difficult thing is if you try and make time for it in order to support you and your mental health,
Mm,
then actually you're falling more behind with all the work and the pressures. So then it makes it
mm,
even worse. So you're like, well, I
yeah,
can't make time for these relationships. I can't make time for looking after myself because I'm
yeah,
even more behind then. I'm even more stressed. So
yeah.
it's crazy that in this sector and, in many other kind of sectors, revolved around kind of care, I guess, as well,
Mm,
in order to, I don't know, like in order to support ourselves, we can't really do that. We can't really take care of our mental health. Um, we need to
yeah.
kind of see everything as well. It's either one decision or another. Like we either have to plow on, and get our
Mm.
heads down, or we try and do something about it, sort our mental health out. But then it has that detrimental kind of effect on our work, and then it makes us even more stressed. So, like you said, catch-22. There's seems like there's no way out, basically.
And I think it is. I do think it's possible. Like, there are schools out there where you can kind of enforce these boundaries. So there are teachers who I've met who have kind of suffered from burnout quite badly, and then said, I'm going to give it one last shot and move schools,
Mhm.
and come across a school where they can kind of enforce boundaries to say, I'm staying late once or twice a week, but every other day I'm leaving at whatever 4:30, 5 o'clock,
Mhm.
so that they have some kind of balance. But I think those kind of schools and those contexts which kind of respect teachers and educators' boundaries are few and far between,
Mm.
from my
Yeah.
experience, and that's my experience alone. But I think the figures retention and recruitment, all the rest of it, I think that speaks volumes, really.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's a bleak picture, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess kind of this conversation leads us on to like the final part of your article, which is all
Mhm.
around self-care versus aftercare. And when I read this in your article, like I said earlier, my mind was just like, oh my God, I get it. I really get it. But I was not aware of it before. And like when I used to work in practice and also just the work that I'm doing now. Um, and that kind of reminded me of this book actually that I've got there. Why has nobody told me this before? That I know that
Mm.
by Dr. Judy Smith, that I know you've read
Mm.
also. And that's when I thought, right, that's it. I'm actually going to sit down and read this book because I've had it for a year. And that was kind
Mhm.
of my um, self-care thing, but it was very much aftercare. You're going to burn out to that extent that then you're going to take a break. But actually, that isn't self-care. That's just, like you say, there's that difference between self-care and aftercare. So I just kind of thought it would be good for you to share that with, the wider community and your thoughts and experiences of that.
Yeah, sure. Um, I think it's always also something I've really struggled with, and I'm still figuring out now, I'd say. Definitely. I think this idea of kind of trying to be proactive with your self-care, and kind of reevaluating, well, what do we mean by self-care, and is it actually self-care, or am I just waiting until I've pushed myself too far and then I'm trying to kind of claw myself back?
Yeah.
Which I think is what I've done for most of my teaching career, because I think it's linked to what we were talking about earlier, that it's a very giving profession, and it's kind of the idea of serving others before putting others before yourself and all those kind of things. So a lot of staff in quite caring professions do that by nature and by default, kind of put their needs and their wants and their mental health as kind of secondary before their work. And then I think it was over the summer, and I'm really hope I'm pronouncing her name right, but I came across a conversation with Nedra Glover Tawab. I really hope I pronounced her name right. With this really interesting idea of, are you practicing self-care or are you practicing aftercare? And about the importance of what those things look like for you, because it will be different for every person, but definitely. Also it will be different kind of each day or each week, if you like. So for example, if you've had a really intense week at work where you I don't know, have been locked away working on a policy or something a bit, kind of isolated from people, but it's been kind of deadlines for governors or data input or something like that. It might be that your self-care that week looks like, I don't know, a family dinner or friends dinner or something, because you need that connection with people. Whereas another week where you've been teaching constantly and you've been put on cover and you've been presenting
constantly
and you've been
around people.
It might be that your self-care is actually, I just need to read a book and get extra sleep or do some exercise alone. So
and be on your own for a little bit. Reflect,
so
perhaps.
I think it was an interesting idea I came across over the summer, and it's something that I tried to take forward into like this academic year, if you like, of trying to incrementally build in pockets of time for yourself and actually get around, kind of address and challenge my own kind of stigma around that, of like, well, that's a bit selfish. I feel a bit selfish doing that, and thinking like, what do I need today, and what do I, because I've never thought of it in that way. But actually, if you think about the impact of not doing that, and where that's taken me in the past, it's like, well, actually that's obviously not working. And actually, if you are okay, it means that you're able to help others in a more present and meaningful way,
it's
rather
that
than
classic
kind
thing. It's that classic thing, sorry, of you can't kind of look after someone else if you can't look after yourself. You can't love someone else if you don't love yourself. And that is something that I'm still kind of working on. And I'm like, well, I care about other people more than I care about myself. But actually, it's not right. And I think only when I think about it in terms of like, if I look after myself, I can look after other people more. That's when I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it then, because it's still about someone else. And I think that just kind of hits a nail on the head. That's what the education sector is, and the health sector, the care sector. We are there, like we were saying earlier, for other people. We're constantly thinking about someone else and always putting ourselves second.
And I think also thinking about it from the perspective of, like in my most recent post as assistant vice principal, there's this narrative in some schools that, okay, we are leaders now, so we're part of the senior leadership team, so that means that we need to think about everybody else's mental health and well-being, but doesn't apply to us, and we don't need to think about, because we're leaders. Which would be great if that's how life was, but actually it's just not, and it's just not feasible, and it's not sustainable, because actually your leaders are the ones who are supporting everybody else. So they
Mm-hmm.
need to be some of your strongest people mentally. So they need to be okay,
Yeah.
so that they can provide that strength and support and kind of unwavering, nurturing for everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so actually, for head teachers, it's setting that culture of support for everybody. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and valuing and knowing the value of self-care for absolutely everybody, from head teachers, to lunchtime support assistants. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's about everybody being their best selves and being able to be their best selves to get the best out of everybody, to be able to support those children. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really interesting point to me, and really interesting idea that always really just confused me. Like, why has that just suddenly become a thing that now, okay, you're a leader, so like nothing, your well-being doesn't matter? It's like,
Yeah,
but
but it's,
actually,
I
what?
think it's hard because it's like, well, who looks after the leader, and even like who's the person at the top, who looks after the head teacher, who thinks
Yeah.
about them? That's always an issue
Mm,
in every industry, really, in
mm,
teams, in business, in teams, in offices, as well as in
mm,
education. um who looks after the person at the top? And I think
yeah.
it brings us back to that conversation of relationships and having people be there for you, having those
Mm,
deep and meaningful relationships, having that support around you. So you've always got someone that will look out for you, but you've got that time that you can give to those relationships, so you
mm,
can strengthen them so that they are there for you, and
mm,
you feel like you can open up to people if you are
mm,
struggling, or they recognize when you're struggling and they are there for you. I think it's kind of clear that leaders often have the hardest time because they're, like we say, they're there for everyone else, they're supporting everyone else. And unfortunately, I think, I don't know any statistics on this, but from kind of podcasts that I've heard and things like that, is those people kind of in leadership positions that do often suffer with kind of mental health problems. And it is just really kind of unfortunate and really sad that we don't focus on ourselves enough. Even as a society, we put ourselves second.
mm,
And it needs to shift from that mindset. Like I explained, this is still how I think. If I look after myself, then I can help others even more. I think that's still unhealthy, because then
mm,
is it really genuine? You're only doing it so you can be there for someone else, but actually, are you truly, truly being there for yourself? Um,
mm,
is it genuine? And that's when it can really make a difference, when it is genuine.
mm,
And therefore, that's when that self-care, I think, also becomes sustainable. Like, we're talking about all the pressures in the sector and whether that's sustainable, and clearly it isn't. But actually, when we step into that self-care kind of mindset and action, that self-care, that also needs to be sustainable, rather
mm.
than, I guess, almost like tokenistic. Like, we can't be like lying to ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. And I think another key kind of consideration is when thinking about relationships. I think relationships with colleagues in school become like just your like kind of lifelines, because they
Yeah.
kind of just get it, and you
Yeah, of
spend
course.
so much time there that they become
Hmm.
your like family, don't they? And
Yeah.
they're your kind of, which is a really amazing thing, and you get some really beautiful friendships out of it.
Hmm.
But I think that's something which is overlooked by
Hmm.
schools, and almost not encouraged. But actually, those
Yeah.
things are so important, because it's such a key factor for making sure that staff are happy,
Hmm.
and supported, and feel okay in their day-to-day job, which in the context of all the pressures we've discussed, it's just invaluable.
Hmm. That is such a good point to make, because I definitely can relate to that so much, and I'm sure so many other people in the education sector can, because often, um, I've had kind of comments and discussions from people that are close to me, actually, around the fact that I'm always talking with people and interacting with people from work. And, I should switch off from work, and I shouldn't message my work colleagues as much, or, just kind of switch off, like, oh, why is so-and-so calling you? Because they're your work friend. But actually, our colleagues are our friends. A lot of the time, those deep connections, those true friendships are formed at work, and especially in this kind of work in education, where you're both just as passionate about what you're doing, and that is part of your values. And it's not a 9 to 5, or it's not even a career job. It's your life, especially in education. So yeah, I feel like you're right. A lot of the time, those work relationships, the friendships with colleagues, they're not seen as true friendships, or as valuable as they really are. And I think it's so important to really be able to reflect on this, and reflect on whether it is unhealthy to talk to your work colleagues, or whether it is actually supporting you. And instead of is thinking about, where's that line, where's that crossing between, am I still working when I'm talking to my friends at work, from work, or is it maybe we can talk about different things, and it's not constant work pressures that we're talking about, but it's more about day-to-day things, or our mental health and support for each other. Perhaps splitting that conversation and the topics of conversation, rather than removing that person from our kind of personal lives. And when we go home, we forget about those relationships. But actually, the people that we do interact with who are outside the sector, like you mentioned earlier, your family, your friends who do try and support you, maybe they don't always quite get it, and that can sometimes make relationships worse, and can break those close relationships, because those people that don't work in the education sector, they don't quite get it. And no matter how much they try, I think a lot of the time I kind of say, you never really understand someone's experiences, because you've never lived as them. It's a lived experience. You'll never ever get it. So I think it's just such a difficult thing in terms of relationships. And
I think it
this
comes
is
down
why
to
it's great to have these discussions, to be able to reflect on this.
Absolutely. I think it comes down, it's like with anything, with any type of relationship, it comes down to connection and just the basic need to feel seen and heard, essentially. And I think it can be quite difficult as somebody working in education to articulate some of the things and the pressures that you're experiencing. So we've been discussing today, for example, the idea of ethical fading. I always felt that, but I've never been able to articulate that to a friend, say, who doesn't work in education, just because I didn't have the words for what I was feeling. So of course they're not going to be able to understand that element of my experience, because I can't communicate it. Whereas somebody, say I've got a really close friend from work, we've never used that terminology, but we've had conversations about those exact feelings. So in that moment and in those conversations, we both, hopefully, we both have felt seen and heard. So that has made that connection like a deep, meaningful connection. And it's kind of like a support network that it comes down to do I feel seen, do I feel heard in a relationship and in a connection. And I think for educators, that's why your colleagues are so important for you. It can just be one person, it doesn't matter, but if they're providing that kind of emotional support for you in a really difficult environment, that can be a really great safety net for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with educators being seen and heard, I think that is the kind of message we need to put out there, in terms of educators being heard by the wider society, and not just by each other. And that is the whole point of kind of why we're here and discussing things like this. And hopefully a lot more people will hear it, and not just those within the education sector, like I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah, I think this is a good point to kind of close off this episode, and you know, and say it's important for the voices of the education sector, for the voices of the early childhood sector to be heard and to be shared. And we're kind of continuing, we're starting to do this, we're continuing to do this, you know, and hopefully this really does make a change, you know, that advocacy, that active advocacy that I was saying at the beginning. And this is the year, like you were saying, where it might just kind of mean that little bit more than any other years, and then make all of that difference. So yeah, in terms of your article then, so you can find Eva's article around educator burnout on the Voice of Early Childhood website. So the link is here on the streaming platform that you're listening or watching on. And I just like to say that the Voice of Early Childhood is all about sharing voices and having that dialogue, just like we've been having now. So those of you who are listening, do continue the conversation by sharing your thoughts across social media platforms. So comment on the posts to spark further discussion, and share your views, share your experiences, and most importantly, continue this conversation. And you can find the Voice of Early Childhood on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and all the social handles are available here on the streaming platform, as well as on the Voice of Early Childhood website. So yeah, I really encourage everyone to continue this conversation, because it's far too important to not take further. And Eva, I'd just like to really express my appreciation for your kind of honesty on this episode, because you have kind of mentioned quite personal experiences as well, and you know, your feelings and your experiences and your views working in the education sector. So yeah, thank you for sharing this time and this space with me and the Voice of Early Childhood community.
Not at all. Pleasure being here. Thank you so much for having me.